That is, that's Toledo, Spain, actually. So that was for about 800 years the capital of every country that spoke Spanish around the world. So Toledo, Spain was the capital of the Spanish Empire for a long, long time. And what's interesting is that, like, this side of the city, that side of the city was quite Jewish, actually. And so we were there, we'll be there in May, Annette and I. Yeah, we're doing like a thing, so there we go. Is that it? Okay. So this morning, what we're going to do is something maybe a little different from what you've been kind of accustomed to, and hopefully this will kind of make sense and help you, but I want to give you a little bit of a framework to what we're going to be talking about, because this is maybe a little bit more kind of like present, now. It's a bit more political than maybe you're going to be accustomed to like hearing when we do a lot of Bible study type stuff. And so it's really going to be about the war in Gaza. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works and what's going on. Some of you, I think, might have been following the news a little bit more than others, so I'm going to kind of keep you up on a variety of different things. But here is the modern state of Israel, okay? And I just want to show you that, like, the white part there is Israel. The part here on the side there where it says Gaza, I don't know if you can see it, but that's the Gaza Strip. So all the war that's happening in Israel right now is all happening just in that one area. Okay? The big area in the middle that's West Bank, that's what that is. And then in the top, there's a section that says Golan with like the sort of diagonal lines. That's called the Golan Heights. These three areas, especially Gaza and the West Bank, are called the occupied territories. We're going to talk about where that comes from, but I just want to sort of orient you to what this is. Egypt is on the south. Jordan is on the east. Syria is sort of northeast, and then Lebanon is north. That's what the modern state of Israel looks like, where it is, what the countries are around it. So, familiar? Okay. So what I want to do is, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel, and I want to give you a little bit of a framework for what's happening there, and be able to kind of talk it through a little bit. I want to tell you what I'm not doing, okay? So we're not proposing a solution to the war in Gaza, right? The US government is not waiting for this meeting so that then they can say, that's what we were supposed to do. Okay, good, thanks. So I'm not an armchair, quarterback for the United States government or anything like that. So that's not exactly what we're going to be doing. The other thing is that we're not having a debate. So this isn't like, okay, one person from this person, one person from this perspective, and so we're going to hammer it out, and whoever wins, all of that. We're not doing that either. We're also not carving out a single position that everybody has to agree on. So when we come to questions of politics, as I understand it, there's probably a lot of disagreement, and that's okay. So I don't I'm not here trying to convince you of any one sort of political position or anything like that. I'm going to kind of give you some history and then talk through some of the debate that's happening today. And we're not going to answer every question that exists, so sorry. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a historical orientation to the state of Israel and how we got here, and a little bit about like how everything came to be, how that map we looked at how it developed. So feel free to ask questions along the way. So if something doesn't quite make sense, but this is where we start. Okay, so these two guys are important. The guy on the left is a person named Theodor Herzl, and he is what many people call the father of Zionism. Zionism is a word that, here's a definition. It is a movement for the self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland in the land of Israel. Theodor Herzl lived in Europe in the 19th century. He was born, I don't know, somewhere maybe 1850 or so, 1860. And he lived there, and the goal of Zionism was, and still is, safety for Jewish people. It's different from Christian Zionism, which is like more of a sort of a biblical prophecy-oriented thing about how God's promises in the past will come to take place in the future. That would be Christian Zionism. But Zionism for Jewish people is really about safety. And the reason why he kind of moved in this direction is that increasingly the situation for Jewish people in Europe just began being worse and worse and worse. And Jewish people were just not safe. And we see that most clearly in the Holocaust, the Nazis, things like that. But in Europe in the 19th century, they were asking a question, like sort of philosophically and in the sort of world of like the elite, and they were asking a question and it was called the Jewish question. And the Jewish question was, where do Jewish people belong? And nobody really had a good answer. And in the Second World War, the sort of the final, work of the Nazis, of the extermination camps and things like that, it's called the final solution, sometimes known as that. You might have heard that term. But it's actually the way they talked about was the final solution to the Jewish question. So the final solution to the Jewish question for Germany in the Second World War was exterminate all of them. And they tried. And they ended up killing about 3/4 of all the Jews that lived in Europe. So the guy on the right, his name is al-Husseini. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem. In Islam, a Mufti is like an expert in religious law. And if you've ever heard a jihad, have you ever heard this word jihad? And like somebody says, I'm going to declare a jihad. A Mufti is the one that does that. The Mufti is considered a religious expert, and they're able to do that. You can't just have anybody do that. So he was the Mufti of Jerusalem and started in the 1910s a national movement of Palestinian people that espouses self-determination and sovereignty over the region of Palestine. And he started what's now known as Palestinian nationalism. Okay? It's similar to Zionism. So it's the idea of self-determination for a group of people. So the goal of Palestinian nationalism has been and still continues to be the transfer of land to Arab Palestinian control, a majority population within the current borders of Israel, and the complete eradication of the political state of Israel. So, Palestinian nationalism is committed, continues to be committed to those three kind of sort of platforms. And the movement of Palestinian nationalism is very much in response to Zionism. And so it's not necessarily an independent movement. It was something that was in response to both the British colonial movement and then Zionism. So, so that sort of outlines two very important concepts, Zionism and Palestinian nationalism. Because to understand those two things is really key to understanding what's going on in Israel right now. Any questions? Yeah?
It's kind of a side question, but what's a jihad?
So jihad would be kind of so the word, I guess, easily translated is holy war, but that's probably a little bit of a sort of a charged concept. But the idea of a jihad is a way of saying that there is a religious thing that we are opposed to. Doesn't always mean violent. Can, but it doesn't always. But it's like we are opposed to this on religious grounds, not just ethnic or national grounds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got a question? Herzl is on the left, yeah.
Where is he from, or was he from?
He was born in Austria, in Vienna. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who's the guy that I'm making again?
Al-Husseini was his last name. And is related, he is related to the ruling family of Jordan today. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I hope this isn't too off topic.
No, that's...
You mentioned something about Palestinian nationalism
Yeah.
against British something, and then also Zionism.
Yeah.
What is that British about?
So I'll get there in just a second. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. All right. So the story of Israel actually starts all the way back here. And I realize this is like a lot of history, and so you're going to kind of get a little bit of a lesson in Middle Eastern history, but that's, if you don't have that, it's kind of hard to understand. So this is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire controlled the area, what is now Israel and Syria and Lebanon and Turkey, for a very long time. So the Ottoman Empire started in probably the 1500s and went all the way through the First World War, which was 1918. So the Ottoman Empire was an unbelievably powerful and stable empire, and it was the World War I sort of ended the Ottoman control, and that is the yellow part. So the yellow part is what was the Ottoman Empire in the early part of the 20th century. In World War I, the people that were fighting the Ottomans were the British and the French primarily. Maybe a little bit Russians too. And as you can see, if you're fighting the Ottoman Empire from the north, you kind of have, there's a big part of the empire that you don't have access to, so it's kind of hard to wage a war. So what they did was they made a deal with the Arab people in the Middle East that didn't like the Ottomans, because the Ottomans were Turkish. They weren't Arab. And so they made a deal, the British and the French. And the deal was, if you fight with us, we will give you an area of land that looks like this. The Arab kingdom of Syria. Sometimes this is called Greater Syria. There's a few different names. If you ever read books of history and you read about an area of land called the Levant, that's what this is. And the British and the French promised, if you fight with us against the Ottomans, we will give you all of this land. Do you think the British and the French followed through on that? Not at all. In fact, while they were promising the Arab people this land, they were meeting themselves and dividing up the Middle East for their own interests. And they created a situation where in 1916, they basically drew a line. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm almost positive that it really was like a room of white men smoking cigars with a map on a table, and they just drew a line. So the line there with Syria, see that long straight line where Syria's on the north and Jordan and Iraq are on the bottom? That line still today is the border between Syria and Jordan. And the border between Syria and Jordan goes back to this 1916 agreement that they made between the British and the French, which was basically pulling the rug out from the Arabs that had fought for them against the British, or against the Ottomans. So basically the blue is French, and the red was British. And then there was an international area, which is today, which part of Israel, although the British took control over that. And this is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916. This is still today in the debate, if you read about this, especially from the Arab side, the Palestinian side, this is still something that comes up. And they'll say, the whole Middle East is not the way it was supposed to be. None of these countries are supposed to be here. There should be one Arab country that includes Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and part of Iraq. One big Arab state. And that's what a lot of the groups like ISIS, the Taliban, they're trying to sort of work toward, because that's the idea. Okay? Yes?
Is there a reason why there's the red and then pink also not just solid red? And same with blue.
Yeah, I don't quite know. It says there control and influence. So there's control. The British had total control in this area and then influence in that area. So why, well, here's a question. Why would the British want total control over the area that's dark red? Take a guess. Oil and access to the ocean. So it's all for financial reasons, really. Yeah. Yeah, when oil was discovered in the Middle East, things changed. Yeah, as you can imagine why. Okay? Good. All right. So after World War I, what happened was at that point, not the United Nations, but what was called the League of Nations, set up a number of mandate governments. They were supposed to be temporary, but they were pretty long-standing. And in Palestine, there was a mandate government. It wasn't occupied, but they were sort of the I don't know. They were like, they watched over it, which basically meant they were in charge. And the mandate initially was all of that, Israel and Jordan. was supposed to be one group that was called the British Mandate. It was divided along the Jordan River, and Jordan was created, and then Palestine was created. So there's two places. Palestine, there is no Israel at this point. There's Palestine and there's Transjordan that are both part of the British Mandate. And this was basically the status quo from 1921 until 1948. In 1917, there was something called the Balfour Declaration, and it basically said that the British government is committed to establishing a Jewish state somewhere inside of this area. So remember, Zionism's going on, late 19th century, it's gaining steam. By 1917, it had gotten a lot of strength in Europe, especially in England. And so they said, okay, in here somewhere, we're going to create a Jewish state. But there wasn't necessarily a commitment to where or when or how big or how small. It was just somewhere. So during that time then, Jewish people started immigrating into this area, mainly from Europe, but not only, but mainly from Europe. And the kibbutz movement started. Does anyone ever heard of what a kibbutz is? Any idea what that is, kind of? Yeah? Yeah, it's kind of a community of people. It is like a real, true communal living environment in the beginning. All of these people were sort of like European socialists and communists who were doing this. And so they lived together in these kibbutz. So a kibbutz in the beginning, nobody owned anything. It was all communal owned. There was a house that was for the children. So the children would be, after about maybe 2 or 3 years old, they would go and live at the children's house. All the meals would be eaten communally together. It was a commune. And that's how they lived. And there were hundreds of them that sprung up around Israel, and these were part of the founding of Israel. They still exist. And so the kibbutz movement was established. Tel Aviv as a city was built. It didn't exist before this. And so Zionism really picks up speed around the country, or around the world. As Jewish people are moving in during this period of time, this is when the Palestinian nationalist movement rises up and says, we don't like all of this. We don't like what happened with the British. We don't like what's happening with all these Jewish people moving in, and we're losing something that we believed was ours. So you can see the sort of the roots of the conflict already starting to brew. During this time, there was a movement started in the Muslim world that was called the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was started in Egypt. And have you ever heard of the Muslim Brotherhood? So the Muslim Brotherhood is like the parent to what's going on in Iran, the Taliban, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of the Arab nationalist movements, and even in Iran, which is Persian, those like religious nationalist movements all sort of kind of come back to this group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was formed in the 1920s in Egypt. And it was partially about what was going on in Israel. So all of this is going on until about 1940. 1940, two really important things happen. One of them is that in World War II, the war is really starting to pick up speed. And so in 1939, there was an event in World War II called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And that sort of launched this huge anti-Jewish hostility. This was right around the time that Annette's parents or grandparents left Austria. And the ones that stayed probably didn't survive. But so the need for Jewish safety became even greater. And then the second thing was the British limited immigration. The British said in 1939, okay, you've already had enough people come to Israel, and so we're going to stop immigration. So you've got these two factors that are going on. Europe, where Jews are increasingly unsafe, and Israel, the one place that there's supposed to be safety, and the British are like closing down the border. So as you can imagine, there's like a lot of hostility. There's a lot of fighting. People are fighting for survival at this point. And so at the end of World War II, what happens not just in Israel or Palestine, but all around the Middle East and even into Asia, a lot of the countries that were colonial are becoming independent. And they're becoming independent through a kind of a rough and difficult process. So this is happening in Palestine, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Pakistan, in India, in Burma, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, all of these things. So starting in about mid-1940s until mid-1960s, about 50 countries are created around the world. And that's coming out of colonialism, going into sort of an independent nationalism. Some of those countries are still trying to find their way, and you see a lot of revolution and stuff, but it's all still happening. So that sort of brings us up to late 1940s and this. This is, oh, I should stop. Any questions at this point? I just went through a ton of history that is hard to get a handle on, but I'm trying to give you like an overview of things, so. Yeah.
Do you know if Palestine was involved with like World War II conflict and like actually conquest at all, or were they?
So the British, I mean, were part of World War II, for sure. The Germans were not in Palestine. There was an attempt by the Palestinian nationalist movement. They actually were trying to get Germans to come and solve their problem. There's quite a lot of like history that was going on between the two of them, but the Germans never made it down to that area. Germany was in North Africa, but not Palestine. Yeah. So it was a little bit off the radar from like really where World War II was happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Most of them, yeah.
Sorry, was it that Europe kind of said, want to make you guys your own country, or was it that they had revolutions or both?
It was both, but also I think there was a sense from the world community that the colonial aspirations of countries like England and France and Spain were wrong, and they were oppressive to the native people that were in wherever country they were, because they would just go and they would take all the resources. Yeah. So in lots of countries, you see movements of liberation, some violent, some not, but they all are kind of saying very similar things like, why are you here taking all of our best stuff? Okay, so in 1947, so in 1948, the mandate that the British had was supposed to expire. They didn't really have a plan, but it was going to expire. So in 1947, they came up with a plan to partition Israel and create out of Palestine two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And the Arab state would be called Palestine, and the Jewish state would be called Israel. And this was the plan. Jerusalem would be like an international zone, a little bit like how in Italy, like the Vatican is like its own little kind of country, and so Jerusalem would be similar to that. But this was the plan, and those were the borders that were initially suggested. And this is through the United Nations. That's the group that's kind of working on this. So it was accepted by the Jewish community and rejected by the Arabs. And the reason why it was rejected by the Arabs, you want to remember what we said about Arab nationalism? Or Palestinian nationalism? It was one state under Arab control with majority Arab population. That's the standard. So any partition is just not going to be acceptable. Okay, so as a result of that, there was a war, and this is the War of Independence in Israel. And in 1948, that war started. And eventually ended with, in 1949, this on the right. So there is Israel. There's a very similar kind of layout of what those areas look like. So there's Israel, and there is no Palestine at this point. There is no Arab state. The Gaza Strip is managed by Egypt. The West Bank is managed or controlled by Jordan. And that's where things stood at the beginning of Israel in 1948. So there's Israel, there's no Palestinian state, and those two areas are now controlled by other countries. And so for Palestinians, this is called the Nakba, the catastrophe, an Arab word that roughly translates as Holocaust. And so for Arab nationalists, this is like the worst thing that could have happened, because now Palestinians really have nothing. And so at the same time, immigration from Europe really increases. And so in a matter of 10 years, the population goes from about 600,000 or 700,000 to about 4 million. And so all the Jewish people from not only Europe but around the world all start coming to Israel. And so, and what that signifies, and this was really what Zionism was about, is that there's no place safe for Jews around the world outside of a Jewish state. And that was United States is maybe one of the places where that wasn't true, but it's always been a little tenuous for Jews even here. Okay, so this stayed the same basically through 1967. So from 49 to 67, this on the right, this is what was the status of Israel. There's Israel, and then there is an area controlled by Egypt and an area controlled by Jordan. Mm-hmm.
Why did it become, why the Gaza Strip? Like, how did Egypt end up taking control? And why that area?
Why there? That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure I know all the answers to that. But from what I understand, that what's going on is that these areas, the yellow and the red on the right, these had majority Arab populations. And so they were given like the ability to be incorporated into Israel, and these communities, because they were so densely Arab, said no. And so these were the areas that were really resistant against the plan in 47 and were fighting against Israel during this time. And so they were not interested in being part of Israel. And so then they were left in this like kind of limbo. And so then the two other countries sort of took over management because they also couldn't manage themselves. They were also quite poor. So, yep.
Did any other countries like support like the Arab state or the Jewish state when they were fighting?
Yeah. So for the War of Independence, it was most of the fighting was going on among people who were there and being supported, like maybe with weapons and money from other countries. And so the cause for Palestinian nationalism was basically supported by all the Arab states. And Israel was supported by certainly America. The U.S. has always been Israel's biggest supporters by far. And some European countries. But remember, this is also just after World War II. And so Europe, as a whole, Europe is just like barely surviving themselves. So they don't really have much to offer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are Palestinians just Arabs living in the Israel area, or are they all Arabs are Palestinians?
No, that's a really good question. So Palestinians are Arabs that live in that geographic area and have lived there for, at least a couple of generations, if not many generations.
Oh, the geographic area of like the one state that they were trying to make, or just
No, just this whole area.
Okay.
And so if you think this is sort of the crossroads between like Africa and Europe. So this is for thousands of years, this has been like a crossroads, and people are always kind of coming and going and settling for a while and moving. So lots of people have lived there over a long period of time. Okay. So now what happens is what's going to start happening is you're going to start seeing now a little bit more of what has led us to the situation we're in now. So in 1973 and there's in 1967, 1973, and 1982, there are 3 wars that Israel fights against its neighboring countries. So Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, in 1967, are all planning to attack Israel at the same time. And so Israel preemptively strikes back and pushes the borders from the bottom of Israel all the way to include the Sinai Peninsula. They take over and occupy the West Bank and also a part of northern Israel called the Golan Heights. And this is where the occupied territories first emerge. 1967 is when they become occupied. Those countries then in 1973, oh, and this is called the Six-Day War. So this war lasted 6 days, and Israel took all that land in 6 days. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. Yes, Annette?
Just to give you guys a perspective, the modern state of Israel, which is a little bit smaller than this thing, right? This what they captured during '67. But the modern borders of Israel, it's about the size of the state of New Jersey.
Or a little smaller, actually, yeah.
To give you guys a perspective that this is
Yeah,
quite a small piece of land that was being fought over.
yeah. So, okay, so that's 67. 1973, so 5 years later, those same countries say, we're going to attack Israel again and get this land back. And that war happened, and Israel was able to sort of rebuff them. And so there was nothing out of that was achieved. So all the borders then stayed the same in 73. And that went all the way until 1982, which was a war in the north. And that was with, this is a Hebrew map, but that was with Lebanon. And there was an attack against Israel from the north by a group called Hezbollah. They're still around. And so they tried to attack from the north, and Israel pushed them back. So in all of these wars, what happened is all the neighboring countries are attacking Israel, and Israel, in response, creates this sort of like safety border around Israel. And that's what the occupied territories are today, for the most part. But in Jordan, there's like a safety border. In Egypt, there's a safety border. And on the west side, the West Bank becomes the safety border. So there's these sort of safety zones that are developed. Now, you can imagine that for Palestinians living in the middle of all of this, it's not pleasant. You know, there's wars happening. You know, they're sort of caught in the crossfire a lot of times. So what happens is there's an uprising. There's two of them. And it's the uprising of the Palestinians against Israel is called the Intifada. That's a word that you'll hear from time to time. The Intifada, it's an Arabic word that means uprising. So it's a liberation movement. And there was two kind of intifadas. The first one started in the late 80s. The second one started in 2000. And the first one is called the Intifada by Stones. There's a lot of like rock throwing and things like that. You can see this image, which is quite a striking image. And the second Intifada was much more violent, and this is where you start seeing things like, bombings of restaurants, bombings at bus stations, and it was a lot of terror. At the same time, there were during this, the movement of Jewish settlers into these areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, also started really getting much stronger. So there's a lot of hostility going back and forth. And during this time, actually during the first Intifada, is when Hamas was started. And Hamas was started as a group, as a militant arm of the Palestinian liberation, or a militant arm of the Palestinian national movement that was violent, specifically violent in its attacks against Israel. If you know anything about Northern Ireland, does anybody know anything about the history of Northern Ireland? there's a lot of similar things going on in Northern Ireland at this time with the Irish, the IRA. Yep. Oh, so it's kind of a similar movement. This is where the group now that is in Gaza is called Hamas, and that's who they are. Okay, that's kind of where they came from. So what about peace movements? In 1973, when Israel took over that land, in 67 and 73, those two wars that didn't go well. In 1979, 1980, there was a peace movement, and it was between Egypt and Israel. Egypt was the first country in the Middle East to recognize Israel as a sovereign country, and the president of Egypt created a peace accord where he traded all of the land of the Sinai Peninsula back. It was traded back from Israel to Egypt in exchange for a lasting peace. And so the Land for Peace formula was really kind of started there. A year later, the president of Egypt was assassinated by Arab terrorists because he made peace with Israel. The next effort for peace, which was significant, was in 1993. It's called the Oslo Accords. They met in Oslo to work on this, and it was again an attempt for peace. Land given to Palestinian control in exchange for a peace. And in this time, it was all the Gaza Strip and then this patchwork of areas within the West Bank. They were able to kind of hammer this out. And this happened in 1993. And in 1995, the Prime Minister of Israel was assassinated by a Jewish extremist because he made peace with the Arabs. So what you see in the 80s and 90s, the two most significant efforts for peace were both stopped by religious extremists on both sides. And so that really cements the kind of situation that we see ourselves in now in Israel, which is this. This is what Israel looks like today. The Gaza Strip is under complete Arab control. Israel completely removed itself from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And in the West Bank, there's this patchwork of Jewish settlements, Arab towns, and it's all sort of, it is what it is, you can see. But there's a lot of mistrust on both sides, and the sort of situation in Israel has been deteriorating pretty consistently in the last maybe 20, 30 years. Shall we go on? That's the end of my little history part. So, okay, you can ask one question because you're not a Joshua student. Okay.
Even the war that's going on right now is because we tried to have peace again with the faction, the different groups, and both sides didn't like that.
Right.
So it started back.
So here's the situation. These numbers are a little old, but here's the situation that we have. And if you're not familiar, I want to just kind of let you know what happened. So on October 7th last year, there was a And it was the last day of the Jewish holiday Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. There was that 2,000 men entered Israel from Gaza through 29 different breaches in the border fence. 1,200 Israelis were killed, 4,600 or so were injured, and 222 were taken prisoner. The youngest was about 7 months old. The oldest was, I think, she was almost 90. In response, Israel has launched a war on Hamas. Hamas is the government, the elected government in Gaza that runs Gaza. And Hamas was very clear that we did this. And so there was no mistaking. So over the past few weeks, the next weeks, war is kind of breaking out in the south, also in the north, also various attacks in the West Bank. 10,000 Palestinian deaths now, it's over 20. 15,000 injuries, I have no idea. It's many, many more than that. Fighting has erupted in other areas in the West Bank. Other countries, it seems, the US and England in particular, are kind of positioning themselves in the Middle East to keep other countries out of the fight. There's lots of calls to end the war, and hostility toward Israel is raging on college campuses. And I'm not sure how much you guys are familiar about that, but it's very, very much happening. Lots of Jewish students are, feeling threatened and things like that on campuses. So college campuses is really where the kind of the fight around the war of ideas in the U.S. at least is happening. So. I'll just tell you one last thing, just so for us. So our staff in Israel, we have about 50 staff in Israel. Several of them have been called up into military service, and a few of our staff have kids about your age that are in Gaza now. And so one in particular who I know is trained in more of a military, he's a sniper. So he's been in Gaza the whole time. And then we have a couple of other people that are medics and a few others that are guards and things like that. So in Israel, everybody serves in the military. It's required. Boys serve for 3 years, girls serve for 2. Girls serve in full combat units. There's no difference. It's just whatever you you apply and whatever you kind of get accepted into. And then you serve in reserve. Everyone in the military serves in reserve duty until they're 55. And it depends. I mean, they're they're not going to call someone who's, very out of shape or something to go into Gaza. But being part of the military is part of life in Israel. So, yeah, sure.
Was this the first time Israel's launched that violent of an attack? Because it seems like the Arabs have a history of violent attacks, but what about Israel?
Well, so there are these 3 wars, and then after the wars, there was sort of an internal uprising, and so there's been skirmishes every 4 or 5 years. There'd be wouldn't be really a war, but it would be more of a sort of a military effort. It would happen for a couple of maybe months, and then it would be over. But just to give you an idea, from 2005 until now, Hamas from Gaza has fired rockets into Israel. There hasn't been a single year that they haven't fired rockets, and usually they're firing anywhere from 800 to 1,500 rockets a year into Israel. And to give you an idea, it's like, it's not that far, you know? So to drive from the border of Gaza to Tel Aviv is about 45 minutes. And the town, which is close to that, which is Ashkelon, you know, it's just 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, you can see the Gaza Strip from your apartment. So, yeah. Dallas?
Yeah, I think it's interesting with the map that you showed with the settlers and the Arab towns.
That one?
So with that is one of the reasons for October 7th with Hamas is they feel provoked because settlers are going in, right? And they're going,
Yeah.
we're going to take the land.
Yep.
Like, we're functionally Zionists, and we're continuing to be Zionists. We're going to continue to take the land. We're creating this. So was that part of Hamas going, well, let's put a stop to it? Because a lot of those towns that they took around the Gaza border aren't in the West Bank where they're settlers, because that's Israeli
Right.
territory. But maybe explain with what's going on with the settling.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions that I have like that get into that in a second. So let me see if there's any. You had a question, I think.
You said that Hamas is the elected ruling group. It's not some extremist group on the side. It's the elected group of Gaza. Okay.
In 2005, Israel had settlements in Gaza, had about maybe 7,500 people that were settlers in Gaza, and removed them all, and removed every military presence from Gaza, and just gave it to the people who were there. And they elected in 2005 Hamas as the government. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of crazy to have a group that's committed to the destruction of your country right next door, you know? Okay, so let me, sorry, do we need a break? Keep going, all right, okay. So there's 4 questions that I sort of like suggest as a framework. And I'm putting a few, I'm going to kind of also talk a little bit about it from like a social media standpoint. So here's an interesting quote I recently saw. According to an analyst by Humans, this kind of website, 7.3 billion posts with pro-Israel hashtags have been published since October 7th, compared to 100 billion posts with pro-Palestinian hashtags. That's a lot. Since October 7th, the language on social media related to the war in Hamas is pretty strong. You will probably have seen some of these if you do a lot on social media. But I'll include some of these in the talk. So the first question that I think a lot of people ask is, does Israel even have a right to exist? Is it legitimate? Is it like, has Israel stolen all of this land that was rightfully Arab? And that's a legitimate question to ask. And I think the core of much of the questions about whether it's colonialists or settlers or Israel or whatever, and so the answer when people say no, it's not a legitimate state, usually it's because the land was gained through illegitimate means. It was stolen and ought to be returned to its rightful owners. Second, the body who decided to authorize the state, the UN, didn't have any jurisdiction over Israel, so it wasn't their decision to make. Third, any historical claim to the land of Israel has expired. 4, there's no recognition of Israel by neighboring Arab states. And 5, The only legitimate state would be an Arab majority, political, religious state. So that's the sort of argument. On the yes side, that Israel was created through normal means in the same way that all of these other states in the Middle East were created. So there's a set of laws that govern all of this. Israel has over 70 years of functioning democratic stability. It adheres to global norms, like there are free elections, there's a free press, etc. Historical claims to the land does matter. Jews deserve a home as much as anyone else, and Israel is as much of a home to Jews as there are to anyone else. And support by Israeli, and this one's an interesting one, support by Israeli Arabs is significant. So Israel, not including Gaza and the West Bank, has about 3 million Arabs in its population. And they regularly ask, are you satisfied with Israel? And the answer is about 70% say yes. And in any country, that's about as good as you'll ever get from anybody. Even in the States, like how many people are satisfied here with America? About 70% say yes, pretty much always. So there's a support internally. Now, what about the Palestinian people? Do Palestinians have a right to exist? And does Palestine as a country have a right to exist? Well, for me, the answer is unequivocally yes. If Israel has a right to exist, so does Palestine. But after at least 6 significant attempts to give land to a Palestinian people to create a state, the answer has always been rejected. Like over and over. It's either all of it or it's nothing. That's it. So there's no compromise. Hashtags, Free Palestine, or Bring Them Back. This is a hashtag to bring back the hostages. And one of the claims that Israel has made is that Hamas has taken hostages that are just civilians. The kid that was taken captive, who was 7 months old, he's still in captivity, and so are both of his parents. They just lived in the neighborhood. What does a 12-month-old kid have to do with fighting Hamas? And Hamas has refused to let them go because there's leverage. Okay. Next, is Israel an apartheid state and therefore responsible for what happened on October 7th? So here's the idea. Apartheid comes from South Africa. So in South Africa, the government created a separation based on race. If you were black, or in South Africa they call colored, if you're mixed race, you are not part of the white majority. And the laws that they had preferred the white majority. So in America, we would call these in like the 40s and 50s the Jim Crow laws, if you remember like what that is. So this would be like, well, you can't use this these schools are for white kids and schools are for black kids. And the schools for white kids are much better than the school for black kids. But this was not a national law. These were state laws or county laws. If the United States made those Jim Crow laws national, that would be what South Africa did. So taking those local laws and making the whole country. So the claim is that Israel has created a different status for Arabs and Jews. Interestingly, just a couple weeks ago, South Africa at the World Court made a claim, and they actually had a group of judges assess this, and they said, no, Israel's not an apartheid state. But the idea of this is that if Israel was an apartheid state, it justifies an armed, violent uprising. So that what happened on October 7th is actually not Hamas's fault, but it's Israel's fault. This is the gaslighting question, right? The husband that beats his wife and says, well, she deserved it. It's her fault, it's not mine, right? So it's the same sort of argument. Okay. So for those that say yes, right, they're saying, well, Israel is an oppressive country. There's records of abuse. It prefers Jews over Arabs. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza are unlawful, and violent acts are necessary to break the system of oppression. No, Israel is a democratic state built on democratic principles. Consistent efforts have been made to create peace, to create autonomy, trade land for peace. Again, the satisfaction among Israeli Arabs, and safety measures put in place for protection. The next question, is Israel a non-indigenous colonial state? And this kind of gets into the question of settlers. Is that the idea of colonialism, which is quite popular right now, and if you find yourselves on a campus, on a secular campus especially, colonialism is a word you hear bantered, sort of used a lot in lots of areas. The idea is that it's one group that is not native to another place going somewhere and telling that group to do something that is not native for that group. Currently, one of the things that's going on in the world that affects believers is that there's increasing charges that missions is essentially colonialism. All missions. And there's a lot of movements that are saying every missionary should just go home. And that voice actually is going to get louder, I think, in the years to come. But the idea is, historically, is that Israel is not native to the Middle East. They're Europeans, or they're from other parts of the Middle East, and they've come here and they've sort of taken away the land that rightfully belongs to Palestinians. And it's continuing to happen with the settlements. So the settlements are going into areas that are largely Arab and setting up towns and then having lots of children. So settlers are kind of famous in Israel for having 10, 12, 15 children, each family. And they're just slowly, they're like playing the long game. And they're like slowly moving the populations out. The question of who this land belongs to. Since Israel, under the Israeli Judean government, what we would call Judah, ruled the land of Israel and then was taken captive by the Babylonians, Israel has been controlled by Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Islamic Arabs, Catholic Crusaders, Mamelukes, Ottomans, and British, all trying to say that the land rightfully belongs to them. So all of these people could make claims to the land because so many people have lived there for so long. So, on the yes side on this one, again, Zionism is a European movement. Historical claims for the land have expired, and Arab populations were forcibly and illegally removed by Jewish settlers, as an example of colonialism. And on the no side, Israel has a history in the land and was forcibly removed by the Babylonians from their home. European colonialism is imperial, which means that, like, the colony sends back all of its resources to the mother country. Israel is not bringing goods or resources to anyone else. Zionism is a global movement, not just European. And Israel itself is an example of liberation and anti-colonialism. So the next slide, so from river to sea. Have you heard that? Has anyone heard that phrase? No? Okay. If you do connect with this, you will almost certainly hear this. From the river to the sea is become the most common slogan in the Palestinian liberation movement to date. And that is that from the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, should be all a Palestinian Arab state. And so you might see that, you might hear that, and that's kind of what that means. It stems from this question. So the next question, which is the last one, is, and we've been going for a long time, so I know, thank you for paying attention. It's a lot to take. But is all criticism of Israel anti-Semitism? Like, is it even possible to be critical of Israel? Or is that just, is that like not possible? Well, of course it's possible to be critical of Israel. You can be critical of any government. But you need to, if you're critical of the government because of what the government does, or what they stand for, or what they want, no problem. But if you're critical of the government because the government exists, now you start sort of moving into the area of racism and anti-Semitism. So if you say, oh, well, I don't want women in charge of things because they're just not smart enough. You're not making a statement about what women can do or can't do. You're making some general statement about women as a whole. And that's not fair. That's where it crosses the line. So when you say, when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitism, that's when things sort of change. So in this case, it would be being critical of Israel and some of their efforts, okay? But when that expresses itself by then drawing a swastika on the door of somebody's dorm room at school, which has happened a lot, now that's crossed the line to anti-Semitism. Because what the swastika means is that Jews don't have the right to exist. And that's where things sort of change. So I can talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, but that's going to kind of take us in a whole nother direction. But I'll just show you an image. And I'll just leave it here for a second, and I want you to look at the image, and I want to sort of point out a couple of things. But I think this is an image that is an anti-Semitic image. So take a look at that. It's a street mural that was done in London about 10 years ago. Oh, and there's a thing sprayed on front. Okay. All right, so you got it? Okay, so what's crazy about this is this just this is just 10 years ago in London. All right, so you got, what game are they playing? Monopoly. And this has nothing to do with the people that were playing Monopoly when we came in the other day. Okay, it might be hard to see, but the pieces on the board of Monopoly are, can you see what they are? Yeah, it's hard to see. They're the capitals or like images from countries around the world. So there's an Eiffel Tower, there's a Statue of Liberty, there's a few other like pieces that are the significant countries around the world. I think there's a building that's in Kuala Lumpur. So the idea is that these are the industrial countries or cities in the world. What's the table that the board is sitting on? People. What kind of people? Brown people who are bent over, who are in sort of probably some sort of native outfits that are being exploited. That's the idea. And what are they doing? Well, at this point, they're just holding up the board for the game. Who's playing the game? Bunch of white men, all with big noses, slightly overweight, and all of the typical like Jewish stereotype images. And above them, what's that like pyramid with the eye thing? You all know what that is. Wow. Okay. So what is that? What is the idea of Illuminati or this kind of thing? Yeah. Sure. Right. So there's this, it's the idea that there's this small group of people that are really like controlling everything, but they're sort of behind the scenes. You don't actually know who they are, but you know that they're there, right? Like a shadowy kind of group. Uh-huh. Well, that would be an example of anti-Semitism, right? And so the Illuminati is a kind of a classic sort of conspiracy theory that there is this sort of group behind the scenes pulling all the levers of society. And so often this was a claim that was made against Jewish people. And so this, initially, the person who really like brought this to the front was the head of the Labour Party, which is the more sort of left-leaning party in England. And every Jewish person who was in Parliament in England said, "What are you talking about? This is like obviously a Jewish anti-Semitic image." And he said, "I don't see that. What are you talking about? It's not anti-Semitism. It's about liberation." And so it's interesting how you can see an image like this, and you can look at and see it from different ways. But when we talk about anti-Semitism, we often talk about things like a dog whistle. Have you ever heard that concept? Like, what's a dog whistle? You're nodding. I can't remember your name. Right. And so when we think about racism or anti-Semitism and we use the phrase, "it's like a dog whistle," what do we mean? Yeah, like it might not be like something that everybody can hear, but the people who are sort of the recipients of it, they can hear it. And I think most of us have experienced that, where we're in a group and somebody says something, and we think, "Oh, wow, that's not cool." And then the person might say, well, what are you talking about? I'm just talking. What's the matter with that? Yeah, Annette?
Can you give a few examples of those terms and phrases that are being bandied around in America today?
Sure. So I'm gonna actually just end that because we're done for now. Yeah, I mean, I've had people tell me things like, well, you know, Jews control the media, and you know, and I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you know, there's this idea that like the media is run by this sort of like group of Jewish people, or it won't be Jews control the media, but it will be something like, well, you know, all the media is really run by the same group of people. Or Hollywood, you know, it's those Hollywood elites. They all happen to be Jewish. And so I think those are two examples. Do you have something in mind?
Yeah, I mean, the word elites.
Elites is sometimes used, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so I mean, there's a whole thing about like what is anti-Semitism, but it comes up in this, and it's come up a lot in this conversation about Israel and Gaza because of what's happened on college campuses where Jewish students have been intimidated by other students or even by their professors. And it's quite a big deal, particularly in the kind of the big East Coast, like Ivy League schools. So the president of Penn and Harvard were both fired over charges of anti-Semitism.
But even at UCLA, there's been
Yeah, you'll probably see Free Palestine from river to the sea there. So, all right. Well, I'm done. That's as much as we'll do today. It's a lot. Thank you for letting me do that. I think you know, it's tough to honestly to like get a handle on some of the things that are going on around the world news. I find that history and looking at history is a really helpful lens. And going back a little bit and trying to ask the question, how did we get here, is a very, very helpful lens. It slows you down, which is good, and I think it clarifies things. So, yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Question. So the term anti-Semitism, where does that come from?
Who first came up with that? I mean, I think it sort of came out of in the 50s or 60s as people were trying to get a handle on what happened in Germany during the Holocaust. Like, okay, you might not like somebody, but why do you want to exterminate all of them? You can read about this in the book of Esther. You know, Haman is angry about one thing and he decides to take it out by, well, I'm going to kill every Jewish person in the whole land. You know, what's going on there? And so I think anti-Semitism is a way of trying to understand that. And here's a definition. It's antagonism or violence against Jews because they are Jews. There's plenty of Jewish people who do things wrong who deserve to be criticized. But if the reason why we criticize them is because they exist, then that's where things cross a line. Yeah.
So I got a question. I know we're going to be going into
Yeah.
discussion after this, but it seems like there's an upswing
Well, I would say that that's sort of an evidence of anti-Semitism. There's an uptick in Holocaust denial. There's also an uptick on just sort of general conspiracy thinking. You know, COVID's really not a thing, right? I mean, you've probably heard a lot of this, lived in the middle of all of this. Between what's going on, COVID, politics, the world, the war in Gaza. I mean, I've heard people say, you know, none of this happened. There are no hostages. You know, none of that even happened. I just think it's a way of sort of denying something that, and kind of supporting it. Okay, it's really hard for me to understand because it doesn't really make sense to me. So to be honest with you, especially the Holocaust denial piece, it's really hard. There's a great movie, if you would like to see it, when you're done with Joshua, so you don't break all your rules, sorry, and it's called Denial. And it's about a court case in England about Holocaust denial. And it was a woman here who is a professor, and a guy who is a Holocaust denier in England. It's quite a powerful movie, actually. It's very good.
And she also wrote an excellent book. She's a professor at Emory University in Georgia.
Yeah.
Her name is Deborah Lipstadt, Lipstadt, Deborah Lipstadt. She wrote a book called
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism Here and Now. And
Yeah.
it's actually really good because she directed it towards college-age kids to understand why is that stuff cropping up here in America now and around the world. It's a very, our 23-year-old daughter's been reading through it. It's been really helping her understand the hatred that's going on college campuses right now
Yeah.
towards Israel and Jewish people.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's probably, again, too much to get into, but there's another piece of anti-Semitism that I think is spiritual, and where God made a promise that the Jewish people would always exist, and that if you want to really kind of like say that God is a liar, extinguish all of the Jewish people, and you'll achieve that. And so I think there's, on a spiritual dimension, that the enemy is always trying to undo God's promises, and this is one way that he has. Yeah. Okay, so I think oh yeah, Annette, you have last words. Oh, Had Gadyan. I'm not on I can't get online with this computer, so I can't. I was going to go online to look at it. We'll have to do it later. Okay, I'll send you a link and you can show it later. The Jack Black thing. So it's. Yeah, I know. It's classic. It's classic. So.
I can find it. Right now, we don't have time.
Yeah.
Yeah.